Welcome to the Professional Technical Interviewee. I'm Taylor Dorsett. In my 6-year career in technical recruiting, I realized that just about every company does technical interviews differently. Many very good senior engineers do not do well in technical interviews, despite being great developers. The only way to get better at interviewing is to practice. Many early career engineers don't really know what a technical interview is like until they're in their first one. Our goal here is to change that and shed some light on the technical interview. My guest today is Francois Toubol. He's been leading companies in Chicago like SimPartners and Lively for many years. We talk over his interview style and in the second half tackle a coding problem in a number of ways and even used recursion. I hope you enjoy. Is it Lively or Lively? It's Lively, right?
Lively. So Lively. It's pronounced Lively, even though, it's interesting. We are writing an Alexa skill right now. And so, Alexa, I think it's pronounced Lively because that's the way it's written, right? And so we have a bit of an interesting problem to solve there.
Oh, like I'm sure that's
writing it a certain way, but having it understood another way. So,
yeah. Probably someone who's just figuring out how to do Alexa skills as well, also trying to solve what seems like a fairly complicated problem, right?
I don't know, it seems that our industry of software development, at least, I'm an old fart, let's put it that way, right? And I don't know, I started writing code in the mid-80s, and as a kid, you're just playing around and stuff like that. But the industry has evolved a lot to the point where you can do amazing things with very little lift in terms of the amount of work that you need to put in. Sure. And an Alexa skill, actually, we spiked that, I think, a couple of sprints ago. And Mehdi, one of the engineers on the team, basically was able to crank it up in a couple of days.
Oh, wow.
A prototype, right? It's not completely integrated with the product or anything, but now you can say, hey, Alexa, I've got Google, so at least I can say, Alexa, it's not gonna pop up. But hey, Alexa, are there package rating for me? And then you would know, from Lively being, software for tenants and residents in multifamily buildings. So that they can know, if there's a package for them. That's just an example of the skills that we are building. But super low lift, Mehdi was able to do it in a couple of days, basically.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. I mean, I believe I know Mehdi. I think he was a guy when I was, in recruiting, I sent many messages to trying to pull him somewhere.
Yeah, there is probably less Mehdi than there are Francois in the Chicago tech scene, I guess, at the end of the day. And Mehdi, is just such an amazing and a special character and human being in my life. I learned so much from the guy within the last 18 months that we spent together. So, he's the real deal as far as I'm concerned.
Well, let me.
And you're gonna be. So are you? Just let me ask the question. I thought that you made that kind of shift in your life, right? Mm-hmm. And go to a boot camp like many people do, and try to go down that path. Are you going to continue to contemplate some of your work as a recruiter as well, or you're just all in software development now?
Yeah, I've got a couple. Basically right now I have partnerships with recruiting companies where I still have a lot of engineers or managers who reach out to me saying, hey, we're hiring, or, I know you're not a recruiter anymore, but do you know anyone who can help me find my next role? And I refer people to companies. So I kind of have partnerships. I haven't, I've thought about it a little bit. There are a lot of, software companies in the recruiting space where I'm like, I could probably be an asset there. Right.
Yeah.
I almost deliberately for this first role tried not to be attached to that because I've been so, the last 6 years has been recruiting. I wanted to, sometimes you get too specialized, right? And I wanted to see what it was like outside of that, right? So my role now is with the healthcare company. Sense. And then I also do some consulting on the side that's like more small businesses, which is, I think healthcare was something I recruited a lot for, but never worked in, right? So that's been nice. And then the small business stuff is more similar to a lot of the clients that, I always had as a recruiter, but now working with them as an engineer. So that's kind of a new side as well.
Yeah, yep. It's I don't know. I remember seeing the post on LinkedIn when you really made the switch and just
Yeah.
thinking, wow, it's and it happens more and more.
Hmm.
And historically, you had to go through studying math at the university and then get a CS degree, and that was the way to do it at the time. And that resulted because I believe we have a strong problem in diversity at a young age with regard to STEM in general. I'm talking kids in junior high
Yeah.
or high school, and there is just a reduction in diversity that happened for some reason there. And seeing those boot camps, and that's that barrier to entry that is significantly lower than what it used to be for that particular aspect of the industry.
Yeah.
um, just just enables that to happen. One of the best engineer we had at Sim Partner was an ex uh, um, doctor in biology from Northwestern, and she
Sure.
made the switch to programming. Spent I think 3 months in boot camp over there, and ended up being like one of the stellar engineer at Sim and then at Reputation.
Yeah.
She's one of top engineers there now. So yeah, that's another good example, and really excited to see that happening.
Yeah. When so I worked at Actualize, which is a coding boot camp for a couple of years, as basically the director of outcomes, like helping people get their first job. And that's what kind of really opened my eyes to, as a recruiter, I think a lot of times you're often talking to you're trying to find the best people, which sometimes might fall a little bit more into that like engineering minded stereotype or engineering like stereotype personality. Right. And once I went to the boot camp, I realized, a lot of the people that are coming through the boot camps they're just normal individuals who are, fairly intelligent and smart enough. But what they realized was they weren't really happy with whatever career they kind of gotten on board with, and they wanted to make the switch. And it wasn't like it was going to be an insurmountable thing, right? It's people who were just normal folks who
Yes.
could make that move.
Yeah.
So that really opened my eyes to just
Yep.
like the diversity of individual who is now in that space. And I think in Chicago alone, there's been a huge boom since Dev Boot Camp. I don't know, probably 8, maybe 10 years ago at this point. The first
Yep. Yep.
shop there that really, people might say flooded the market now, but definitely opened up the types of individuals that are in Chicago.
Yep.
And now a lot of those people are managers and even CTOs, right? So it's kind
Yes.
of
Yep.
really helped expand things out of that traditional computer science, math science background, right?
Yes, and we still have a long way to go, to be fair.
Yeah,
But
sure.
that's very much a force working the right direction from that perspective, for sure.
Yeah. Well, let
Do you
me
think?
introduce you.
Yep. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So I guess today is Francois, who's a Chicago-based CTO and longtime engineer here, successfully started and then ran several companies in Chicago that exited, including Sim Partners, which a couple years ago was acquired by Reputation.com, and then most recently has been with Lively for the last couple years. And if you want to introduce kind of Lively, what the platform looks like, and then your role there and kind of what your team looks like, that'd be great.
Yeah, yeah. So Lively is in the property technology space. We are focused on resident and property manager experience.
Mm-hmm.
So you can think about a multifamily rental building where everyone in the building rents their unit is basically the market that at least at that point in time we are focused on. And all those people really have their phone to interact with everything as it relates to their building, from their key to open their door, to opening their door, to communicating with their neighbors with a micro social network within the building where they can exchange, they can sell things, all the things. Running events and services is also a big thing. So say, for example, I am in the office and I realize I'm not going to be back in time to walk the dog, then I can give access to my unit to a dog walker for a specific amount of time. And then buy that service, have the dog walker come in, take my dog out and bring it back in. For example, that's one of the value prop. But it's really a platform that enables everything to run within the building, from Running amenities, for example, is another big thing. Activation of dead space. So there are a lot of dead space in this building that we can repurpose, for example, into package room. We also have package scanning technology. So that's a big aspect. So it interestingly enough, from a sales funnel standpoint, it's a challenge to sell this platform offering, because there is so much to it that it can get overwhelming from an information standpoint. But yeah, the value prop, to take it down to the elevator pitch is providing the best-in-class resident experience so that residents renew their lease. Because when a lease does not renew, there is a lot of money that is lost for those owners and operators.
Yeah, I've certainly moved out of buildings that I enjoyed in the past based off of, everything involved with living in the building, like the amenities and how they were handled. So I'm sure there's lots of folks that are in the same situation.
Right. So yeah, that's what Lively does. I work with product and technology and CS at that point in time as well. I think to me, that's a Lively t-shirt, by the way. Stay resilient.
I love it.
And I think being resilient and being flexible, we're going to talk about it during the interview process, are some kind of intangible that I'm always on the lookout for. So when you ask the question, what I'm doing at Lively, I'm doing whatever it takes for the company to be successful. And I think that when you work in a startup, we're talking about a company, in the case of Lively, around 40, 50 people. It's, at that size group, there is no, it's a can-do attitude that's going to win every day. So sure, of course, I'm on the technical side because that's my upbringing, but I'll do whatever it takes at the end of the day. And part of my job is also to clearly articulate that and make sure that everyone is aligned from that perspective. And again, as we go into how I personally look at interviewing and onboarding people, culture fit is the first thing. And it's not a negotiable thing. You can be the best developer in the world. If you're not going to work within the context of what we do, which is not for everyone, it's not like you can articulate your culture. Of course, you want integrity. Of course, you want hard work. Of course, but you really have to nail down on what it takes to be successful at your company within that context, and then go out for that and figure out whether that person is going to be able to do it. Yeah. Now, resilience and flexibility, as I was saying, is really something that helps you no matter what. That's why it's something that I always look for. But yeah, that's what I do at Lively. I do whatever it takes, That's pretty much it.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I mean, hey, it's been a while since I spoke to anyone there, but I know in the early days, I think folks maybe came in the mornings and there was like a personal trainer there that everyone would do workout classes together. Have you heard of this?
That predates me. And so, yeah, there is always funny stories like that. But basically, Lively started, and that's something that really resonated with me at the beginning when I got there. Lively started within one of Alex's building. Alex is co-CEO and one of the founders of the company, and very much having a vision that's even broader than just Lively, because he's an owner-operator, in particular of a brand of building called Flats in Chicago. And yeah, that's a big part of his vision, the software layer for his resident experience. And it started within his building. And it's such a huge advantage for an early stage startup to be literally within the same environment as their own user and interacting with their user on a daily basis. They're not going into, high rise in Chicago and trying to, intellectualize what people are doing. They are there. They are living the same experience. And that's fantastic. If you manage to do that, that's amazing. There is a lot of, the lean startup philosophy that tries to encourage that happening. That is your product team going on site and experimenting with your clients. But for Lively, it was like everyone was there. Yeah. And that's fantastic. And so in that sense, on the service aspect of it that I briefly touched on some of the things that we do, there is personal training. And so I'm not surprised. I didn't know that particular story, but I'm not surprised that that's the case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in those really early years, that's when Lively was a client in the past. So I just have, there's always fun stories
Mhm.
of the early days of startups, right? So um,
Yes.
your role now, I'm assuming, the company's grown quite a bit since you've been there over the last couple of years. Are you actively interviewing, or have you interviewed recently at Lively?
So when I arrived in summer 2019, um, amazing work has been done from a product discovery standpoint. A lot of experiment, a lot of what we were just talking about, things that work, things that didn't work, lesson learned, very much lean startup kind of philosophy early on.
Yeah.
And then at that point, there is a lot of excitement from the investor side of things, both within the industry, so companies like JLL, and also out of the industry, like our first seed round lead investor is actually Pritzker Group VC.
Oh, sure.
And so a lot of people are very interested. There is a big cap raise that happened at that point in time in March 2019, and now it's basically we need to build. What we have identified is the market need. We need to build,
Yeah.
and that means two things. You need to build a team, and then you need to have the team build the product, right? From that perspective, I mean, there's different ways to approach that transition from discovery to delivery, but that's one way to approach it, I guess. And that's the way we took. And now, fast forward 18 months and we have a solid product offering on the market at that point in time. Throughout that, so early on, when I arrived, there is a big prod, a big growth prod, basically doubling the size of the product and engineering team within the first 90 days.
Wow.
And that can be traumatic, right? We can talk about that as well. But those kind of growths are challenging.
Sure.
I was fortunate not only to have that whole discovery aspect of things done by the team prior to me joining, but also arriving with really an outstanding team in terms of the seniority level of the engineers across the board. So we had a very good base to try and grow it. And at the same time, what's challenging is that the expectation for those team players to have someone on the team are very high, which
Sure.
in turn makes the growth that needs to happen that much more challenging, when you have high criteria for selection in the funnel. So, we solved a lot of things at that point in time, but that growth happened within, the first quarter I was there, basically quarter and a half maybe. And then throughout Q4 2019, Q1, Q2 2020, that was a lot more focused on running the team that we had at that point in time and optimizing our practice so that we can become better at what we do.
Yeah.
And they quickly became very, very, very good at what they did. Unfortunately, the next thing is COVID hits, and COVID is very much an opportunity for us, but also, just in the vacuum for B2B sales cycle, which is what we're talking about. The application is certainly a B2C application, but our clients are not the resident. The resident don't buy the app. The owner's operator buy the app. And they find themselves with a lot of things to take care of when COVID starts, in those multifamily building. And so they are not ready to add another layer of what they can perceive as complexity, even though what we try to do is simplify their life, right? But those B2B sales cycles tend to be challenging. And so there is slower growth than what we projected through 2020, like many companies have experienced. And we had a bit of attrition as well through the process. So we are a bit smaller now, but a very cohesive and amazing team, both from a culture standpoint and from a raw commitment and skill standpoint as well.
Yeah.
And so to long story short, but to answer your question, at that point in time, we are where we are from a product standpoint. We are well positioned, both from the team and the product itself. And what we're trying to do is accelerate our sales cycle and get the sales engine off the ground at that point in time.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You touched on what I think is an interesting point. Is something a lot of people don't think about is companies when they often after someone raises funding, right, then you go into this hiring cycle where typically it's let's get X number of engineers on, or at least fill up these teams with enough people, right, fairly quickly. But then
Yes.
people really don't think about, well, it's the ramp up time for those individuals as well, right? It might only take you 90 days or maybe 120 days to get most of the people you want on board, but then you might have another 90 to 120 or even longer before everyone's kind of, clicking and gelling well and able to actually
depending on the size. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think that's an added level of complexity.
100%. I think you start with the why, right? You really have to understand as a technology leader, you don't, the answer to why is not because we raised money. Yeah. We really have to have a plan and a strategy as to why we're doing what we're doing. What does success look like? What is our contingency plan if we don't get there? And tie that back to the financial of the company, of course. But there needs to be a reasoning, which was very articulate and clear with Quad to Lively in terms of our plan from a product development standpoint at that point in time. And then to your point, the second aspect of it is ideally, you at least want to do both at the same time. But ideally, you would want to do the first one at the same time, which is setting up the right environment before you staff in. So you want to build the seats before you put the players in the seat to some extent. Because that way you set people up for success. And that way, something that probably is going to come back in the interview, you're being clear, and being clear is being kind. I'm quoting Brené Brown, but it's very important. If it's confusing when someone gets into your company, then it's being unkind to them. It's dangerous because you're not setting them up for success. And last but not least, what they see and their first impression of what is expected of them or how the company is run is going to be their baseline assumption on how things work. Absolutely. And so setting up that environment, which especially in technical team means it's not just, of course, it's a lot of soft aspect in terms of core values and how we work together and soft skill and all the things, but safety and building safety so that teams can work well together. Safety is also something that's very technical. It's, can I release my code 3 times a day without being afraid to take production down? You know what I mean? Or I'm exaggerating, but there is a lot of technical things with regard to building your environment that are going to make it very clear that you have your organization together as a group, and that you look at safety not just from a soft skill standpoint so that people can exchange and debate idea and be okay to be wrong and all the things, but also from a technical standpoint. So ideally, you want to do that first so that ramp up time is shorter and expectations are really clear. If you can't, you have to do them both at the same time, which we did at Lively, and we were successful doing that because there was a baseline of engineers that were very, very senior at that time.
Yeah, I think it's often underestimated how much work that can be, right? Especially when you're trying to do everything else that goes into running a startup at the same time. It's easy for the new person to get forgotten about, or just, even if it's a couple hours, early in their employment there, it can be stressful as a new employee, right? Going, am I supposed to be doing something right now? What's the expectation, right? If that's not clearly defined. And I think, like you mentioned, it's that first impression is so critical. I've heard it said that if someone leaves within the first 90 days of starting, a job, like that's not on them, that's really on the company, right? Because they're probably going to give you at least 90 days. If something's gone wrong at that point, then, there's something you need to address internally, right?
Yep, which is why recruiters put that 90-day period. To some extent,
absolutely. Well, any recruiter will try to push it down to 30 days, right?
Right.
And then any company will want to do 120 days, right?
I don't know. I don't know what your thought on that, but there is certainly a perception in my group of peers, at least, that there is just something wrong about the entire system of recruiting, because your incentive as a recruiter is just to place more candidate because you get a commission on every candidate.
Yep.
And that's not conducive of building good relationship with a company where you staff those engineers. There is all these non-solicitation stuff as well that is on all our contracts, which is not conducive of the best interest of the community at large in any tech community, in that case, Chicago tech community. So there are a lot of those variables that kind of play against us as well, that we have to be careful when we look at the outside world.
Yeah. And I think I always have a soft spot for recruiting firms, but also knowing that, a lot of recruiting firms are fairly, I don't want to say unethical, but maybe they're looking out for the bottom line. But what I always used to say was, the longer a guarantee gets, right? Like, as a recruiting firm, your job is to introduce someone who a company wants to hire, but then after that person's hired, you really have no control at that point, right? If it's 120 days later and that person isn't working out, I can't really do anything about that, was what I used to tell clients, which it's true. But also, if they would have introduced 5 more steps in the interview process to make sure that person was a good fit, I probably would have pushed back on that too. So it's difficult. I don't think there's a perfect solution, right?
Yeah. No, there isn't. It's just about understanding each other's objectives and needs and trying to work together for the better. And choosing your partner is important. And, we've worked together quite a bit in the past. So that, at least for me, that reflects on your work as well.
Yeah.
But go ahead. Yep, go ahead. I was going to say that how you set up the interview funnel is probably the most important question in order to make sure that you're going to be successful. And how you optimize that funnel is very important for many different reasons, right? There is many things for which you might want to look at your interview funnel and optimize it. One could be candidate experience and brand, which is very important for high growth company. One could be that you're losing candidate to the length of your funnel, and they are getting offers from other companies too fast. One can just be, we need to grow faster. One can just be, we need to get better quality candidate through the door. It can also be a problem of precision, and we call that is thinking about false positive and false negative and how you want to handle one with respect to the other. What is the cost of one with regard to the other? A false positive is very damaging in that interview process. And so you end up with a lot of those funnels just weeding out candidate that could be good candidate, but just by weighing that false positive aspect of it, you just don't want to take the risk sometime. And last but not least, what I've seen most often as an optimization variable is just we are spending too much engineering resources on hiring. And as a result, we are losing an opportunity cost as it relates to our product development, especially in high growth company with senior engineer where the bar is very high. And so there are multiple things you can do, but at the end of the day, it's very important to think about what is your context, both what you're trying to achieve pragmatically with your interview funnel, and of course, my 2 cents, but being extremely clear about who you are and what is your culture as a company, so that you can consider that variable first in your interview process. Rest in peace, Tony Shea, but to me, that was the very first management book that I've ever read. Delivering Happiness and the story of Zappos. Yeah, it was the company book at Sim Partner. If you were an employee, you needed to read that book first thing.
Wow.
And
I just read it about a month ago. It's anyone who I think is building a company.
And it's timeless. Yeah,
should read it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's kind of timeless, and it was very much ahead of his time. I think it was written in 2008 or 2009, something like that, maybe before. And one of the tenets of the book is you hire and fire based on culture first. Mm-hmm. That's how he puts it, and he says you can be the best engineer in the world. If you're not going to match the team, then, it's not going to work out, kind of deal.
I think famously.
So those two things.
I think they have gone to the extreme, right? Of what was it? Paying employees $2,000 or $3,000 or whatever it was. If they finished their training, they said you can take this money and quit, right? Which I think that's the epitome of it. If someone values that over the potential opportunity and the culture and the role, then you're getting off easy, right? If it's only
yes, exactly,
right.
Exactly. It's very basic. It's like, imagine the cost for you if that person stays in your company.
Yeah.
It's a lot more than $2,000. So
Yeah.
it makes total sense when you think about it. Yeah. It was very forward looking. You know, it was talking about those, you know, things that are mainstream now, core values, company culture ahead of his time. And then he switched into something that actually was developed in Chicago. I don't know too much about it, but holacracy was something that he was very adamant about, and kind of destructuring the structure of hierarchy into more responsibility-based environments. So always someone ahead of his time from that perspective, for sure.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
you mentioned a number of things that impact the interview funnel, and I'm curious, what are you typically evaluating for when you're having candidates actually come through the interview process, right? Because that's something that I think,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, culture, obviously that's hugely important. But I think you touched on two things that can be a huge hurdle for companies, especially if you're trying to grow quickly, which is one, using those engineering resources, right, who could be building, right, to actually do
Yes.
those interviews. I think that's, I always used to think of it as every hour you're interviewing is an hour away from production time, right, or an hour away from production code.
It's
And
more because it's an interruption, right?
sure,
I'm
right,
interrupting you,
yeah,
ironically, but the cost for an engineer to change his mindset in the middle of the day for an hour is much more than an hour lost of software development, in my opinion.
yeah, absolutely. You can't just pick up a phone and do the interview and then hang it up and get back to coding, right? There's other stuff involved as
Right.
well,
So
right?
there
So
is context switching.
yeah,
Yeah, there is context switching. There is your and also there is your unavailability to work as a team. So that
sure,
your front end dev, you know, your back end dev, you're interviewing for a back end candidate, and your front end dev is like, you're missing something in the contract and I cannot move forward. So
yeah.
they are going to have to context switch as well and go on to something else and use their time otherwise. So yeah, it can get tricky, you know, especially when the scale is larger and you're trying to grow fast, or when you're very adamant about the quality that you want out of the funnel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are you evaluating for, apart from culture, obviously that being a huge piece?
Yeah, so that's definitely it's and fortunately culture is probably not the hardest, in my experience, not the hardest thing to figure out and vet out, as long as you Google, you know, behavioral interviews and try to understand how that work and build a plan based on that, and just execute your plan as an interviewer during the interview. But it's, you know, it's not too hard if you have good soft skill, which in general those people who are leading technology team do have. I would like to think, and so that's okay. You know, it's not too hard to do. The bulk of the interview is actually going to be whether the candidate qualifies on the other side of it as well. But to answer your question, it depends on the context, right? It depends on the context. Even the culture side of things, how you're going to evaluate it, highly depends on the context, because the context is the culture in that case. And the way, so if I really take your question literally, what am I thinking about? How do I prepare for an interview? Really depends also where in the funnel am I interviewing. So maybe you can, like, let's take the example of something that I've been through multiple times now. We are trying to optimize the funnel so that we don't need to involve a lot of engineering resource while we are weeding out the majority of the candidate, because that's the way the funnel work.
Sure.
Odds are playing against you as a candidate. We have to be clear about that, right? So one way to optimize that funnel, in my experience, that I've seen working well, and you're going to see there is a bit of a controversial part to it, but the very first part is very typical, which is a call with HR, generally 30 to 45 minute max. 30 minutes is a good timeline for that. And it's just high-level behavioral phone interview, just to make sure that there is a cultural fit there from their perspective. The second step in that funnel would be something that is half a deeper culture fit assessment. Hopefully that takes from 10 to 15 minutes, and then a 30 minutes algorithm technical coding interview. And it has worked out for me. What can I say? I know that it's kind of controversial, and some of the question, and when we go into the second part, maybe you're going to see a bit of that. It becomes very theoretical. It has to do about, it talks, we're going through algorithm optimization, a lot of things that if you're interviewing for a FAN company, you have to study by the book a lot before you get there, for example. And maybe the bar is not as high when you're getting into a startup, but for me, that's something that presents the advantage of being low lift in terms of the cost to figure it out. So we can spend 30 minutes and I'm going to have a decent idea of, what are your skill on that particular very, very narrow, it's very narrow area that you don't often use at work. I completely recognize it, right? But I think it's linked to other skills as well that eventually turn out well. It's also, of course, a very good soft skill evaluation experience while we are going through the exercise, because it helps me understand better how you think about solving a problem, which is like the meta aspect of it, which is extremely important. And also how you communicate about it. Are you afraid to make mistake? Are you afraid to ask question? Are you asking too many questions? Do you find that right balance between autonomy and asking for help? All the things come through that exercise very easily. And by doing it that way, I find that we can, a good benchmark for us is 15% of the candidates are going to make it through these first two filters. Mm-hmm. And then you're working onto the rest of the funnel, which is much more involving on your engineering side, but you're working with a subset of candidates that you believe are going to be largely successful because you're within a much lower percentage of your top of funnel, basically.
Sure.
That's all. But that's solving for one problem, right? If you're trying to solve for other problems that we mentioned before, then the strategy would be different, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think when interviewing can get frustrating on both sides is when maybe a company doesn't know exactly what they're trying to solve for, right? Maybe they know they need to hire engineers, but they don't have specific problems they need to solve for, or they don't really have specific roles they're hiring for, and sometimes they're trying to figure that out in the interview process, right? Which I think is expensive for companies to do, and also costly from a time perspective for candidates, right? So I think having a clear idea of this is what we need from this, and almost a rubric or something like that you're evaluating with, I think can be hugely helpful, right, on both sides, and makes the process much better. Because like you said, you only want that 15% or whatever that percentage may be that's actually going to go to a final or late stages of an interview. In theory, that's someone you've already kind of pre-selected as this person could be a good fit, right? They just need to pass these last couple bars, and then we'll figure out if we're actually going to make them an offer, right?
Yeah. And those bars are more costly from an engineering team involvement standpoint, if you want to do it well. But there are less candidates, and therefore the overall lift is kind of lower. Going back to what you were saying, being clear about your why before you hire is extremely important. Because if you're not, you're doing a disservice to yourself, and you're doing a disservice to the other person, and everyone is starting off the wrong feet, right? So clarifying why you're hiring. So I'm a big fan of scorecards, and using them through the interview process to, pragmatically evaluate what you have on the table for one candidate versus another. I think is legit. It's impossible to reduce people to numbers, but you do your best to try and have evaluation criteria.
Yeah, so I was going to ask if you have a standardized system, because I think that's important. But like you mentioned, it's some type of scorecard. That's how that's what you're using through the interview process.
Yes, that's one of the tools, right? I like to think, as a matter of fact, just like a developer, right? I like to think there is a problem. Here is my toolbox. Mm-hmm. What makes sense in that particular context, right? And really taking a step back and not applying your recipe all the time. You know what I mean? It's very much the same thing in engineering, right? It's not like, I know JavaScript, therefore everything needs to be written in JavaScript. You know what I mean? Or I'm caricaturizing, but the point being, and you rely, personally, I rely a lot on the HR team as well at that point in time to try and figure out, because it's their responsibility and I want to be conscious of that as well, to work together and make sure it works. But being clear about who you are as a company is very important. Being clear about who you are as a candidate is very important. And that's really the base of those first interaction. Beyond that, being clear about what the process is like is important too. So it's setting up your funnel, understanding the different steps, understanding your evaluation criteria, whether you use a scorecard or something else. I'm a big fan of not disclosing thoughts, which is easier said than done, throughout the interview process, so that everybody gather and we all go thumbs up or thumbs down at the same time. It's terrible to say that, because you're really talking about people, right? But that's what it is at the end of the day. Do I want to work with that person? Do I think they are going to be successful or not? And not interacting or talking to one another, and not influencing one another until we come to that point. And that always sparks very interesting discussion when there are some disagreement. But generally, most of the team is aligned on yes or no.
Yeah, it was interesting when I was, whenever I was hiring as a recruiter, I used to try to, I would go meet with the individual and then I would come out and someone would ask, how are they or how'd they do? And I'd say, well, why don't you go in and ask about X, Y, and Z, right? Trying to get some more information about something. But if you share too much, like you said, it does color that interview, right? The next interaction where they might go, this person isn't going to work out. Maybe I only spend 15 minutes with them instead of 30, right? Which I think can really make the interview process difficult as a candidate.
Yeah, that's another interesting one. If you feel strongly about something, then again, it's being clear, it's being kind. Giving proper feedback at the end of the interview for the candidate is so valuable for the candidate, especially if they didn't make it through, so that they really understand why. And it's not like, whatever, I'm going to say XYZ, we're looking for someone like that or whatever.
Sure.
It's really providing actionable feedback at the end of the interview is so valuable for them. And at the same time, that's the best service you can do to your company, because the experience that the candidate has throughout the interview process, if they don't make it through, is you're going to have someone out there. I've got quite a few stories where we got second-hand candidates that actually made it through from candidates that did not make it through.
Sure.
And it's just thinking about caring for people, building your brand, caring for your company, and then making the right thing. But that feedback at the end is so crucially important.
Yeah. How do you approach that? Because like you said, I mean, that's it can be a great source of candidates. If you have someone who interviews and doesn't do well, but they enjoyed the process, they're going to tell people about that. And likewise, if they hated the process and didn't get an offer, or even did get an offer and end up turning it down or don't work there, they're going to tell people about that as well, right? So how do you deliver that feedback, though, where you're protecting yourself from liability of, maybe anti-discrimination, something, right? But to also... hoping that people aren't going to be too upset with you if you said you failed your coding interview or get into an argumentative mindset, right? Because I think that's the hesitation for a lot of companies.
But you always have a choice in life, right? Do you want to expose yourself, and do you want to be authentic and truthful, or do you want to protect yourself and put your armor on? I think it goes way beyond the particular topic that we're talking about there. But I think in the vast majority of cases, people are struggling between that fight and flight mechanism, which is, I'm either going to say something and make an enemy, or I'm going to shut up and everything is going to be okay, but I'm not going to get my point through. And again, that goes way beyond just that particular situation, but it applies there, right? So there is always, that's what's called a full choice. There is always a way to say what you have to say in a way that's kind, in a way that's respectful, in a way that's going to create value for the other person, even though it's not easy to say.
Sure.
And you can always try your best. You might not find it. You might screw it, and actually, the person is going to come back and sue your company. I don't know, but there is always a way. The question is, are you going to be able to find it or not? And so I'm kind of politicking around your question, but that's really it, right? Are you ready to be vulnerable? Are you, and are you ready to spend the time actually writing down some actual feedback that's valuable for the person? All
The
this
time. Yeah, I think
is to be
that's
taken into consideration. Yeah.
I think having
I've
the empathy, but two, the time and actually making a conscious decision of, this is, I'm going to care enough about this individual instead of just writing hey, we're moving forward to the candidate's email and then it's done, actually trying to be helpful. Right. But like you said, that creates a better experience for people. Even if it stings a little bit at first, they may go, okay, well, I can go work on that thing. And 6 months later or a year later, they might be a great fit for a different role. Right. So I think that's important in building those relationships.
I have a small story there. At some point, I interviewed for a VP of engineering position at Root Insurance when they were really growing, couple of 2 or 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I interviewed with Dan Magnus, the CTO over there, who used to be the CTO at Braintree as well.
Yes.
I talked to the guy for literally an hour, and I was inspired. A lot of the things that I did afterwards came just from that conversation. And just because I sent an email at the end as well, and I say, hey, do you have feedback for me? And, I did quite a few things that he had me reflect on as well.
Mm-hmm.
But he was very kind. He pointed out where I was a good fit and where I wasn't, and why, and what were action items for next time when I'm encountered with this situation, so I can be more thoughtful about my answers.
Yeah.
And him taking the time, at that point, Root is already a big, successful, I don't know, probably 500 people company.
Yeah.
He's a co-founder, he's a CTO, he has many other things to do. He takes the time to write a 3-paragraph email that probably took him at least 30 minutes to write.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's just like, wow, that's someone that I would want to work with. That's a company that is caring for what they are doing and how they are perceived, that value their people. And so, that stuck with me. It's those little things. And then I think, I'm an advocate for his work and his company,
Yeah. Well, I thought about that a lot when I was in recruiting, where there were always companies that were not clients of mine, but if someone came through that I knew would be a good fit for, I'd send them that direction and go, hey, I don't need to get paid for this at all. But this person, I know them well, and I know your company well for X, Y, and Z reason. And I think you two should connect. Right. And there were plenty of places that, it was purely because I knew it would be good for both of those individuals. And I think it's because of good interactions with people at that company, which is why I would do those things, right? Where even through third parties, you can make that type of true, networks that will work for you. And a lot of times it comes from just being a good person, right? You're not necessarily doing it for what's the financial or the business benefit at the end of the day. It's just trying to be a helpful, good person, which goes a long way.
Yeah. The most valuable currency is the impact you have on others, because once you're gone, all that will be left of you is the impact you had on others. And so that's Jim Carrey says that to me. It resonates a lot, and I try to abide by it.
Yeah.
So anyway, we went really deep into the soft skill side of things, but there are some soft skills that are intangible. We talked about one of them being resilient, flexibility, because in terms of culture fit, that's going to enable you to navigate different environments. Mm-hmm. I think I always go back to something from Bill Campbell, who used to be a very renowned coach in Silicon Valley.
Has a fantastic book as well.
Schmidt, Coach Steve Jobs. What was that?
He has a fantastic book as well. I can't remember if it's Measure What Matters. The $1 trillion
Measure
coach.
What Matters is John Doerr. So Bill Campbell coached John Doerr, who wrote a book on OKRs called Measure What Matters. The
Both
Bill
of
Campbell
them good
book.
Books.
It was such and I think it's actually John Doerr who wrote $1 Trillion Coach, because Bill Campbell, being a very humble person that not many people know, who probably has more influence than anyone else on the Silicon Valley, because he was a coach to Steve Jobs and Eric Schmidt and other great ones. There is something I always go back when I walk into an interview room, no matter where it is in the funnel, no matter what role it is, no matter who it is. I write down some kind of a variation on his framework that he called smarts and hearts. That's how he puts it. Mm-hmm. And he has a few criteria in there, and I always write them down before getting in the room. Are you coachable? Do you have potential? The way he puts it is, do you have the ability to learn fast? Do you have a team-first attitude and an empathic approach to communication? That's the second thing. The third thing is, do you have the willingness to work hard and the passion? Then he talks about grit, and the way I put it is more on the resilient flexibility side of things. It's literally in the t-shirt. But yeah, that's willingness to work hard, ability to learn fast, team first attitude, empathy, grit. That's what he called those 5 things. That's what he called hearts and smart. And I think, I'll take it. I won't even think about it. I'll take it from the great guru to some extent. And as I go through the interview, I look at this word, and in the interaction that we have together, I'm going to try and pick on certain clues that point in those directions, if that makes sense. Another way to think about it is passion and potential of a raw skill is a good way to think about it, and put emphasis on the soft skill there. Yeah.
So from the technical perspective, I'm assuming at this point in your career, when you're looking for new opportunities, you're not doing a ton of whiteboarding questions, right? It may be high-level technical evaluations, but less go solve this algorithm for me. But in the past, how did you feel like you did in those types of interviews? Did you enjoy those types of interviews? Hate them? I guess, what did that look like for you?
So my story is just I interviewed for my first job, and there was a bit of algorithmic question and whiteboarding. That was back in '99, and then the next thing 2 years later, we're starting our own company, and so it's not like I interviewed for him. We started our own company, and it's 10 years of actually interviewing people and getting the right player on the team. Then moved to the US and again started up the engineering team at Sim Partners. And so same thing, always on the other side of it. And when I come to Sim Partner, there is already a 10 years relationship with John Chepke, the founders and CEO. And so, I didn't interview. It's just like, okay, you come and we do that. We make that happen together kind of deal. Then reputation is an acquisition. So it's not like I interviewed. We stay on board, and we worked on the product integration at that point in time. And then, Lively was more of an executive level interview. And there were a bit of technical questions, but as you said, maybe more on the system design side of things. The same thing when you interview at a FANG company for one of those more senior management role, even a senior engineering manager, it's going to be a lot more. You're going to have some algorithmic question, but it's going to be a lot more about system design and those kind of things. Whether I like it, so I didn't get to do it a lot on the other side, I love it though. So I have a repo of just programming puzzles that I work on. I just, that's an interesting puzzle. Let's see if I can make it happen, and even beyond just algorithmics and programming question, I just love puzzles in general. So enigmas, how do you get out of that situation? I don't know. I just genuinely enjoy them. So I do them for pleasure. That's very nerdy of me, but I'm a big, huge nerd. So no problem.
I love it. So it sounds like, unfortunately I guess the ultimate advice is if you don't want to go through technical interviews, start companies and get acquired, right? That's an easy way to bypass those.
Yeah.
Maybe not the easy way. It's probably a lot more work in the long run, but
I think my recommendation at the high level would just be enjoy it. It can be stressful, of course. I'm not denying that because you are trying to get the job. But when you get in the room, be yourself.
Yeah.
Be clear about who you are. Just like we talked about the company being clear about who they are, you need to be very clear. You need to understand who you are and how you're going to convey it and articulate it, because the fit is important as much for you as it is for them. And then stay curious, ask questions and clarify things. And in that stay curious, all those programmatic interviews, just take it as a fun challenge. You might do well, you might not do well. Some people are better suited to do well in those interviews, and that's unfair to other people who would be really good at the job who aren't. The best you can do, that's what there is on the table. So the best you can do is stay curious and enjoy the process. Because if you do so, then on the soft skill side of things, you're going to come across a much stronger candidate from that perspective also. So it's that don't stress out, which makes you stress even more in some ways. But if you can find that space in your head where you stay curious, you ask for help when you need to. And maybe the most important thing for you to feel comfortable is it's completely okay to not have all the answers.
Yeah.
And actually, the person on the other side of the table is more about trying to understand how you think about the problem, rather than you having an outcome that is positive or negative on that particular question.
Yeah.
So it's okay to fail. If you can, go ahead.
So say something I learned in recruiting was I can't tell you how many times a company said, well, they didn't actually solve the problem, right? But I could tell they understood the problem. They broke the problem down. They destructured it. They were able to attack it in different ways. They asked for help. Like I saw their thought process. And even though they may not have been able to look at it and go, oh, here's the solution, I realized that they're someone who can learn and someone who I could have easily coached through that problem, right? So we're going to move them to the next stage. And those are engineers that, very often they were just people that had a growth mindset, but just weren't quite there yet, right? Where I think something that someone told me very early in my, studies as becoming a software developer was you're never going to be where you're not, right? Which is hugely helpful for me because I was going to these interviews frustrated, probably too early to go into technical interviews and just get stuck on things and then be frustrated. And then that kind of helped me really realize like I'm never going to be where I'm not. So I shouldn't be frustrated about that. And instead I should just think of this as a learning experience and try to enjoy interacting with this individual through the, whatever the technical may be.
Growth mindset, Taylor. You will be there. And it's something that you can learn like anything else. There is a book, the Bible of that kind of stuff is called Cracking the Coding Interview. It's a book that's recommended, for that kind of stuff. Study the book, learn about it. It's going to make you a better software developer. You know what I mean? It's very narrow. Again, it solves a very narrow problem that you don't often encounter in your day-to-day job. But you got to play the game of the job interview, like any job interview, as a matter of fact, not just software developer,
Yeah, I do think it's a frustrating thing for people, but it's a solvable problem, right? It's a known quantity. You're very likely going to have to do technicals, so therefore you should get good at doing those, right? Which is kind of the whole idea of this podcast. Is obviously there's a lot of things involved in that process of the interview process that that maybe people don't have insight into, but that's one piece that is going to be there, right? You're going to be asked to solve a problem at some point. Get good at solving different types of problems in different types of ways, right? So,
and it's fun. Keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Have fun with it. It's going to make everything better. Yeah.
Those are some of your tips for folks interviewing. Do you have would you have different tips or separate tips for people who may be early career, who, they're just kind of, this might be their first technical interviews, or they've been in a job for 6 months to a couple years, but they're looking for like their second job and maybe looking for something a little bit more difficult than their first type of interviews do you have any different advice for folks in that situation?
Again, it's about being clear about who you are, where you stand, showing that you're self-aware of where you stand and where you want to go. It's good to show some some willingness to grow, right? It's the growth mindset. Is I'm here right now, but I really want to get there, and show that you have that grit and that passion to get there. A very simple trick is you're always going to have a first round with HR. And so prepare your questions for them. And one of them should be, what should I expect for the coding interview? Or what should I expect further down in the funnel? How can I better prepare for those kind of things? Especially in startup environment, the HR team or the recruiter are not going to be proactive about telling you that. So you have to ask. And the information that you're going to get there is already going to be a leg up with regard to other candidates that might not ask for that question, and are going to help you feel more prepared, and in better shape. But again, the other advice, and that's for anyone, is don't be afraid to fail. That's okay. We live in a country, and that's so nice about it, where when you fail, the important thing is that you learn something about it. Mm-hmm. And so if you can demonstrate that growth mindset at work, as you were saying, then it's going to be okay.
Yeah. I think it's the great quote, Wayne Gretzky or Michael Scott, depending on who you ask, is you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? And people who, if you're not asking these questions or you're not doing these types of interviews because you're worried that maybe you won't be successful, well, you're not going to get there. But the person who is putting themselves in that spot and maybe being vulnerable and being okay with failing will eventually get there if they continue to try, or, there'll likely be some other good outcome along the way as well.
Yeah. I mean, that resonates a lot. I've got a lot of, it's that problem of recall versus precision of the interview funnel. Mm-hmm. And I've got, especially when you get into more senior position, the company is you're going to fail a lot of interview for very few where you're going to do well. And it's a lot of rejection, and that's okay. You have to be okay with that. And to your point, the only way that you get better at it is to do it more, which is why you're doing that podcast, right?
Yeah.
In a way, you get that out of it to some extent, right?
Yeah. I have told people that obviously I really enjoy these conversations. I think it's very helpful for people to get insight into how managers think, but also there's a selfish side to this, right? Where I want to do more interviews, and I love my job now, but if I can do interviews in a setting where I'm learning something regularly, that's obviously going to help me progress as well, right? So, yeah. Well, before we move into that section, I mean, any interviewing horror stories, personally, that you're willing to share of things that just went sideways that may be helpful for people to relate to?
I'm trying to think of a specific example. I think there's a pattern where you get into that coding interview and you put a problem on the table that you expect is at the level of the candidate that's interviewing, mm-hmm. and it's completely blank. There is no start.
Sure.
I remember. So I work quite a bit with offshore resources as well, but it's the same thing, right? You want to make sure that you get. It's different in the sense that you have to be even more careful on the communication side of things, right? Because not being on the same time zone, or not being in the same physical location, or having language barrier, or having cultural barrier can prove to be extremely challenging. And so you want to be even more aware in those settings. And we're talking about the fact that failing is the first step in a growth process, right? Mm-hmm. And that's very well understood in I think in the empirical nature of building things in the United States, or maybe in England as well to some extent. France is very different. Other European countries are very different, are more a lot of the rational school, like I need to have everything conceptualized in my head and then I'm going to build it. In France, you do the theory in class and then you do the lab about the theory that you learn. In the US, it's the other, or in Chile for that matter as well, it's the other way around. I was always surprised that my kid would go and do things in the lab and then explain them in class. It just didn't fit my mindset at the time, right? So when you interview with offshore resources, I have a few stories where there's a complete mismatch there. And then they become extremely stressed out on the phone. I can remember Michael, one in particular, in Ukraine that we interviewed, and it's a funny story. Eventually, it turns out to be something good, and we ended up working together. But I remember a complete our story in that interview where the problem is on the table. It's relatively not too complex. Maybe that's the problem that we do together. It's not too hard, but he blanks out. And in his head, you can see it in his eyes. It's like, this is a disaster. And everything begins to snowball because in his head, you cannot fail a job interview. If you don't have the answer, that's very bad. And so I guess your role as a manager at that point in time is to try and smooth out things and try to get them more comfortable, to feel safe so that they can move forward. But I'm thinking of that particular example, but there are actually plenty different level of degrees of that happening, right?
Sure.
If you blank out, ask questions. Be curious. Stay curious. That's the number one thing. Stay curious. Why are you asking that question? What are you trying to get out of it? Even if it gets to that, right? If you really have no idea about what they're talking about, can you help me better understand? Can you help me?
Yeah.
That's very, very powerful sentence. Can you help me? I'd like to think that we're all very compassionate. If we think a bit more about it, there's nothing more fulfilling than helping another human being that we can do in life. And we're taught in society with rewards and punishment about another way to think about things, but really deeply in us, can you help me is a very, very powerful question. Or what can I do to help you is another very powerful question. So leverage those kind of tools, right? It's okay. It's okay even to go blank so that you feel more comfortable with it, I guess. But that's one story that I can remember. I guess that there are others, funny ones, but yeah.
I think in my first true technical interview, it's the same thing. I think a lot of people get just stressed and then you panic and it's just an empty screen, right? And the clicking, the flashing blinker, and you go, I have to write something now. And I think I forgot. I couldn't write a basic JavaScript function, and I forgot, how to do like equates, and I ended up passing the interview, but it was definitely the first 5 minutes were pretty rough, and I got along really well with the guy and moved on with the stages. But I just remember, like, I thought, I have no idea and I can't even write anything, right? And I think a lot of people are in that situation, especially if they haven't done a lot of interviews or just are doing them for the first time in a while. Even senior engineers sometimes, right? If you're interviewing for the first time in several years, you go, oh no.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. So a couple of things there. The first thing is your previous life has taught you how to develop strong soft skills, right? I mean, like you're going to do very well there. Not everyone is there, but that's what you want to leverage into situation. The second thing, if you're blanking white like that, the first thing you do, that's very actionable item, write your test.
Yeah.
If you start a coding interview by writing your test, you're telling something to the interviewer right away as it relates to how you think. It's okay. You don't have to necessarily, unless you think that that's the way the company operates and it's all about TDD and you need to work that way, then by all means, go their way. It's not necessarily a route you want to take, but it's definitely when you're having trouble answering the question, when you don't see the function already in your head and you're ready to split it out, then the best way to do it is to say, because the message you're sending is, when I'm not sure, I write the test first, because that helps me think about how to write the function that is going to the function that is going to get consumed by the test, right?
Yeah.
That it's very proficient problem solver type engineers. They're able to run a compiler in their head, and they're able to write code in their head and just spit it out. And that's a great quality to have, but you're always going to hit your wall at some point with some degree of complexity. For anyone else, that's why TDD is a very good practice. For anyone else, TDD just teaches you, it's a design framework more so than testing philosophy, in my opinion. It kind of puts you in a framework where you have to think about what you're doing before you do it.
Yeah.
And so that's, if you blank out like that, like you described, write the test. And by writing the test, you're going to show that at least you understood the problem that was on the table.
Yeah. That's great advice. Absolutely. And if you don't do test-driven development, and there's a lot of companies, or even if you're not testing very much at all, my company right now, we don't do a ton of testing, right? Other than manual, making sure something actually works on a screen, right? I think literally just writing something, right? Or just writing out the basics of the function of what you're going to call, right? And putting in your brackets and that type of stuff at least gets your brain working, right? And then once you get that first, the pavement down, then maybe you can start adding the lines, right? So I think that's helpful. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcasting app at The Professional Technical Interviewee. I want to thank my guest and my wonderful editor and producer, Dustin Bays. If you're interested in sharing your technical interview advice and being on the show, please reach out at dorsetttaylordev@gmail.com. As a reminder, this interview has 2 parts. You can find the second half, which is the live technical interview, on YouTube at The Professional Technical Interviewee. The link will be in the show notes. Until next time, keep practicing.